Hey everyone, my name is Israel Ramos, and today we're going to be talking about the topic of critical theory and its application to education, and specifically how it impacts Christians' scholars' way of thinking about the issue. When we're discussing critical theory, it's important for us to understand that we're actually discussing it within the context. Critical theory exists within the context of that which is traditional. It is a critique on the traditional. And I thought that maybe we could start off our conversation on this topic by thinking about what are elements of your context that inform your philosophy of education. What are elements of your context specifically that inform your philosophy of education? I want you to take some time right now to think about them, to write them down, maybe in a narrative form, share them with someone, or maybe share them in the comment section of our class. And I wanted to share with you a little bit of the context that informs our philosophy of education, the traditions that inform our family's traditional understanding and philosophy of education. When it comes to understanding the context in which I live, there are several things that are important to us in the Ramos household as part of our family traditions. One of the first things that is important that we must share with you are issues that are related to food. Whereas we would consider bread to be a traditional food in most other contexts, what is traditional to us is seaweed. My wife is Korean. Shout out to Costco. Also, tortilla chips. These are, by the way, the top ones because they're thick and crunchy. This is the way in which we heat our house. Traditional ways of heating the home we would consider in our household to be electric heat or natural gas heat. We use wood, and this is the way we heat our house, our wood pile. The way that people live, they establish their own traditions, and in our context, we would consider traditional homes to be homes that are in neighborhoods, but we live on 7 acres of property. And behind me, you can see all of this is our land here. You can't see our entire 7 acres, but this is a good portion of it. When we closed on the house, they said, congratulations on becoming the proud owners of 2 acres of blueberries. These are all of our blueberry plants. We have more than 2 acres of blueberries. During the pandemic, we have 3 sons, and our second son, Micah, decided to purchase these 2 beehives. And so we have a bee farm. We also have chickens. They're currently indoors. This is our chicken coop, our chicken run. And this is our chicken coop where they live. We keep them inside right now. That's a plastic thing for the winter because it gets very cold here. We keep them inside because, as you can see, all the leaves have fallen off, and it's perfect for predators like eagles and hawks to come and get them. Can't forget to talk about how this guy is a part of our lives and a part of our context. And traditionally, dogs live outside. From the context where we come from, our tradition is to have our dogs live inside. So when we're discussing critical theory, as I mentioned before, we are discussing it within the context of critiquing that which is traditional. And the fundamental perspective which we begin with is the fact that each of us have traditions. Our traditions are normal to us, but to other people, they are non-traditional. It's like the opposite. They live in opposite worlds or opposite contexts. For some people, heating with wood is very natural, very traditional. For others, it's not. For other people, eating seaweed is very traditional. For others, it's not. For some people, eating crispy tortilla chips is very, very traditional. For others, it's not. Some people think about having their own food from their own property as something that is very traditional and natural. And for others, this is unnatural. And in some cases, having animals living inside the same place where you live, this is traditional and this is natural, whereas in other contexts, it's not. And so as we talk about critical theory, I think it's important for us to discuss it within the context of that which is traditional and thinking about critical theory as a response to that. And so, what are the key elements of your context that inform your philosophy of education? Maybe you can write a little bit about that and share that with the rest of us. So, with that in mind, essentially we distill critical theory to two major components. The first major component is time and place, and the second component is control and power. When we talk about time and place, we essentially look at critical theory from the Western perspective that as education was developed, as society evolved, and as religion gained control, all of these things happened historically within a time and place. In other words, who we are today is a product of tradition, of time and place. Um, the second component of this critical theory is that not only did time and place create the things that we traditionally view today as education, as intelligence, as what is appropriate socially, as culture, as religion. Not only did these things get created in time and place, but they were also created by systems that had control and power. It was the people that were in power that defined what education looked like. It was the systems that were in power that defined what reality was. And so it is within this context that critical theory says, let's go back at history. Let's look at how these theories developed in time and place by systems that were in control and power. And let's critique these things and find new ways of looking at this world, looking at society, looking at culture, looking at education, and looking at power structures that exist in today's context. The key to establishing the critical science and critical social theory was developed by the Frankfurt School, which essentially had three major components or three major things that it was trying to communicate. And we got this from our book. Number one, it was that ideology impacts consciousness. Education is political, social, and economic socialization. And there's education is not just formal, but is also informal. When it talks about ideology impacting consciousness, it's essentially saying that the ideology of the time has an impact, whether we know it or not, it has an impact as to how we view the world, our personal worldview. And so, if we live in a society where there's a certain kind of ideology, then it is inevitable that this ideology will somehow and some way impact our consciousness. One example of this would be how where we live could, to a very large degree, impact how we understand politics. If we live in an area that is extremely conservative, then that ideology will impact our consciousness, and we will have conservative views, conservative values, and conservative perspectives, whether theologically, politically, economically, etc. If we live in a liberal context, then the liberal ideology will have an impact on how we understand our own worldview, our understanding on certain political issues or certain theological issues or educational issues. Essentially, this point is that ideology that surrounds us will inevitably have an impact on the way we think, so much so that it's at the very conscious level or subconscious level, it forms and it formulates who we are. Another thing that the Frankfurt School thought taught is the fact that education is not just it's not just a system by which we understand knowledge and understand wisdom, but education is much more than this from a critical perspective. Education is political in nature. Education is social in nature, and it is economic in nature. It impacts all of these different things, and so critical scholars would say that education through the educational system is not just designed to give people knowledge, but knowledge is given through a certain perspective, a certain ideological perspective that impacts the way we understand politics, the way we understand society and culture, the way we understand economics, and so forth. And the third component that the Frankfurt School taught was the fact that education was both formal and informal. In other words, there's a difference between schooling and learning and education. Education doesn't just take place in a classroom, but education takes place through life, through living. And so education takes place at home. It takes place through conversations that children have with their parents. It takes place through living in the country or living in the city. What our children do here in our home, it impacts their educational perspectives. So the way they work, it has a certain kind of training or educational component that takes place in the mind that will shape their worldview on politics, society, economy, religion, and so forth and so on. So education is both formal and informal, is what critical scholars sought to do. In the end, from my perspective, there are two critical components to the goals of critical theory. The first component was a component of deconstruction, I think is the overall word that we can use. Uh, the attempt to break down structures, to break down the ways in which people have traditionally understood something. So rather than schooling, we need to deschool. Rather than providing religion, we need to deconstruct religion. Rather than embracing the current understanding of society, we need to deconstruct our own philosophies of what it means to have society. And so, this idea of deconstructing the way we view the world, the way we view education, the way we view politics, is critical to the goals of, or as important, as significant to the goals of critical theory. Another significant goal of critical theory is the concept of liberation, because what we understand today, the traditional structures that we understand today, have had a significant impact on the way we look at education or what it means to be educated, the way we look at religion or what it means to be religious, the way we look at spirituality or what it means to be spiritual. There is this because these ideas have been formulated by people that had positions of power, then the goal of critical theory, by deconstructing these structures, is to bring about liberation or freedom from the oppression that these structures of education, society, religion, politics, that these structures have done, the negative impact that these structures have had on uh, groups that are considered to be marginalized. When we look at the pros and cons of critical theory, these are a few that have come to my mind um, as I've processed critical theory. There are some things that I think are very, very positive when it comes to critical theory. And then there are also some questions that I'd like to pose to you as potential cons for you to contemplate and maybe give some perspective on in the comment section. I think one of the pros when it comes to critical theory is the fact that it provides for us non-Western perspectives, especially for those who have been impacted by an American or Western understanding of education. Uh, Critical theory seeks to say there's something broader, something larger than to education or to society or to religion than understanding things the way the US or the Western developed world understands it. And I think that that's very important. Why is it, for example, that um, you know, education has to be thought of through one singular line of perspective or of worldview rather than the perspectives of other people, right? This impacts, I think, in many ways, it impacts how we view other people. For example, the way we understand wealth, right? We've become accustomed to understand wealth in the United States by having a certain type of income, and obtaining this type of income or this type of lifestyle or this type of wealth at all costs, when other perspectives might teach us that wealth is not the accumulation of riches or finances, but maybe health, right? Or maybe social wealth or or spiritual wealth. All of these different non-Western perspectives kind of are important for us to consider. And I think that this is one of the strong points of critical theory, that it helps us look at how we understand our values as a Western society and look at them from different perspectives. Another thing that is very important to me uh, from critical theory is the perspective that it has when it comes to minorities, the minority perspective. This is valuable to me because I myself come from a minority perspective. I'm Mexican American. Both my parents immigrated to the United States from Mexico. My wife is Korean American. Her parents immigrated from South Korea to the United States. And I've grown up in a culture and in a context where I felt the pressures of being a minority growing up in Los Angeles and then moving to the Midwest. Different, different. There's different treatment, and I experienced life in a unique context. And I think these perspectives are important. When my parents came to the United States, they were here illegally. They did not have documentation, and I remember anytime we drove to the supermarket, thinking to myself, if we get pulled over by the police right now as a young child, I'm going to lose my parents. They're going to be sent back to Mexico. I'm going to be living in the United States by myself or in foster care or through adoption. And I cannot resonate in my experience. I cannot resonate with the narrative of of certain people that will say that people that immigrate to the United States, even those who immigrate here without documentation, fit a certain profile. Although I'm sure some do exist that fit that profile, not everybody does. My experience was certainly very, very different from that. And so I think that critical theory presenting the strength of minority perspectives is very important. I think another key element of critical theory that I think is positive for us to consider is the fact that uh, oppression is a reality, and our country has a history of oppression. Um, Christianity has a history of oppression as well, and oppression is something that clearly exists. And now more than ever, we see that politically speaking, within our last few elections, that depending on the party that takes office, the other half of the country feels as though they are being oppressed or they're afraid of oppression. When the left is in power, then Christians feel that, you know, religious people are being oppressed, and when the right take power, then secular people feel like there's a danger of oppression there, and so I think there's a reality of oppression, and I think it's important for that to be uh, on the minds of us as educators as we're processing our worldview and as we're contemplating our philosophy of education, and as we transmit that to the young people that we come in contact with. Liberation and empowerment. This is also I think, another great byproduct or focus of the critical theory. The fact that it has as one of its primary goals, empowering people that feel marginalized and also bringing about liberation from people that feel oppressed. In many situations, people that live in a context of oppression or marginalization sometimes feel as though they need the help of other people, or they need hope. And certainly, critical theory can provide hope through its focus on liberation and empowerment. Talking a little bit about the potential negatives after discussing potential positives, talking about potential negatives, there's a few things that I wanted to kind of bring about too. And maybe it would be great if we had time, if we were in a classroom setting, um, we would probably have the opportunity to take from the class, what are your perspectives of the pros for critical theory? Do you agree with these or do you disagree? Do you want to add or subtract? That would certainly be great to use for our dialogue. And I would love to hear your perspectives on my ideas in regards to the pros of critical theory, maybe in your reflections. Some of the cons, from my perspective. Um, so I think one of the challenges that we have to really think about when it comes to critical theories the critical theory and its deficiencies is the fact that power structures will always exist. Um, I mean, uh, it's impossible for us to live in a society where power structures do not exist. That, whether for good or for bad, it it makes up the fabric of society. Society will always have people in power, structures that hold power, and it's impossible to get rid of these structures. Number one, it's just not realistic. Um, Secondly, I don't know if we would ever want to live in a society or in a place where power structures were not in existence. I think from a biblical worldview, when you look at Scripture, from my perspective, um, Scripture talks about the importance of structures, and whenever there's structure, there will be power. I think structures bring about power, and so the issue is not so much the evil of power structures, but the abuse of them, from my perspective. And so I think whether we agree with the fact that power structures are good in and of themselves, outside of their abuse, whether we agree or disagree with that, I think that it is difficult to make an argument that there's a possibility or a way to have society without power structures. Secondly, a second challenge with critical theory is the flaw that is attached to deconstruction. Um, to what degree do we deconstruct the fabric of society, our understanding of education, our understanding of religion, uh, at the end of the day, deconstruction to a certain degree works, but beyond extreme deconstruction will ultimately lead to an impractical way of addressing problems. One of these things, for example, is let's say the issue of Christianity in the United States and its impact that it's had on secular education. Some of the critical scholars will say that we need to figure out ways to deconstruct the Christian privilege that we will address later on in this course. But at some degree, it's secular universities, even though they're not religious, still follow a religious calendar, and so religion, from their perspective, is embedded even into the fabric of university life. So I think the weak is has attachments. Our current weak structure has connections to Christianity. So if we deconstruct all of these systems, what would we then do? Do we create a 3-day week, an 8-day week, a 17-day week, and what do we do with the calendar? Do we reformulate our calendar around the world? These things, there's flaws with deconstruction. I don't know if deconstruction is the best way forward. Contradictory elements when it comes to our understanding of critical theory. So, critical theory takes into place context and perspectives of the minority or marginalized people groups. But according to social Darwinism and Darwinism in general, these theories exist and thrive within the context of power. Uh, according to Darwinism, we exist today because some species were more powerful than others, and and according to Darwinism, this is critical. And so when critical theory adopts a Darwinistic perspective as its foundation, we get into problems because these elements contradict each other. How is it possible for society to evolve without power and without the destruction of the marginalized? Liberation is not an act of Darwinism. It would not coincide with that. I think liberation um, is a spiritual value and not a practical value or a biological value. And lastly, the fourth challenge that I see with critical theory is the fact that it offers the solutions that it offers sometimes are actually problematic in and of themselves. So, for example, every time you dethrone a system of power, what you've simply just done is reversed reality. You've now made the current system of power a marginalized system, and you've made the marginalized system a system of power. And so power will shift from one place to another, but the problem will still remain. One group will always be marginalized if one group is always in power. And so the challenges that the solutions of critical theory suggests, or the solutions that critical theory suggests, present a lot of challenges and a lot of problems. And so I see these as some potential challenges with the theory. So I don't know if you agree with these or disagree with these. I would love to get feedback from you on these perspectives. In my field, I'm looking at I'm working in the field that is dealing with higher education in secular settings, and there are certain current issues in secular higher education that I think are important for us to consider and to give thought to as we contemplate critical theory. One of them is the fact that, according to critical theory scholars, religion is a form of power. And so in the United States, um, religion has been used as a way to exercise power. One of the ways in which it's done here in the United States is through Christian privilege, is what critical scholars will say, that there is Christian privileges exists among um, uh, specifically white males in the United States. Um, and what Christian privilege means, according to critical scholars, is simply that um, those who are part of the privileged group have certain social credit that others who don't fit that same group demographic do not have. They have certain privileges that they themselves are not aware of, simply because of who they are. And so in the United States, critical scholars will say that religion is a source of privilege for those who identify as Christians. This is a big deal among secular higher education institutions, where they say that if you are part of the Christian majority or part of the religious majority, if you identify as a Christian in a secular institution of higher learning, that there are certain privileges that you have. What are these privileges? Well, you get the weekend off. Naturally, you have Sunday off, so you have the ability to exercise your religion. If you're part of a minority religious group, you don't have that privilege. Um, Normally, if you need time, you have holidays off. Christmas is off. This is a result of Christian privilege, and if you want to take a holiday off that's a Christian holiday, you would not, in a secular institution, you would not be asked for documentation as to why you need this, or you would not have to prove that you are a sincere Christian believer. And so these are things that critical scholars will say creates Christian privilege. And the way in which religion is used as a form of power in the United States, people will argue, is through its blue laws. If you did not associate with a certain form of Christianity, then you would be ostracized. If you didn't go to church on Sunday, through these blue laws, businesses were closed. You were encouraged to worship on Sunday, etc. And so throughout history, this has been used as a form of power. Certain Catholic individuals could not become presidents. All of these are examples that critical theorists would use when talking about the form of power that religion has, and Christianity in particular has when it comes to Christian privilege. Christian scholars will then point to critical scholars and say, actually, uh, there's actually such thing as secular privilege, not Christian privilege. Normally, even though the majority of the United States identifies as Christian, when they go to secular institutions of higher learning, they are actually a marginalized group of people. They're learning stuff in school where to be a Christian is, to be mocked, and to be ridiculed if you believe in certain biblical understanding of, let's say, the origins or sexuality or these kinds of things. And so biblical scholars will then say, no, the Christian privilege does exist, but so does secular privilege in the context of of higher education. And so that's where the war really is taking place in higher education between secular privilege and Christian privilege, between religious majority groups and religious minority groups. As a result of that, there's recent, within the last 10 years or so, the development of critical religious pluralism theory, which was created by a professor or a graduate here in university in Michigan at the University of Michigan. And the idea of critical religious pluralism is the intent to move towards religious equity. And I think that this is a great place to pause for a little bit and to talk about what is religious equity and how does religious equity look like in a secular university context. Um, is it possible for us to achieve religious equity and equality in public universities? Should that be a goal of secular higher education? And if so, how is it accomplished in a place where you have the spectrum from people who would consider themselves atheists to pagan to Christians to Muslim to Jewish identities, Hindu identities, and so forth? How is it possible, or is it possible, or should it even be an option for religious equity to exist in secular higher education? As we're talking about these things, pluralism through a critical religious um, critical religious pluralism would strive towards making all religions pure, all religions equal. And the way I understand pluralism versus toleration is that pluralism sees every religion as equal in value, meaning that if I identify as Christian and someone else identifies as an atheist, I can say, well, Christianity is my truth, atheism is your truth. They're both equal in value. I think toleration is different, where I would say Christianity is the only true religion and atheism is not true, but I will tolerate your perspective, even though I don't necessarily agree with it, or think that it is true, or maybe even think that it is dangerous. And I wonder what your perspectives are on how I understand what tolerance means and what pluralism means, and I would love to have your perspectives on the values of each and which one is probably the better option when we're considering religious equality in in academic institutions of higher learning that are secular. We cannot have this conversation on critical theory without taking into account the pedagogy of the oppressed, which was part of our reading. Um, Freire essentially talks about the consciousness of ourselves, right? And humanity versus humanity and humanism, and what liberation and education really are. And I was able to read the book in preparation for this presentation, um, and uh, and to reflect on some of Freire's understanding of oppression. And I think he provides something that is worth contemplating when it comes to understanding critical theory in our context today. He essentially talks about these three things: consciousness of self, humanity or humanism, and liberation and education. And what he essentially is saying through our consciousness is what makes us different as human beings is the fact that, unlike any animal in the world today, we have the ability to live outside of ourselves, and we are able to impact reality rather than just respond to reality. An animal does not have the ability to change its reality. It simply responds to its reality. And the reason why we can change our reality rather than just responding is because of the idea of our consciousness. We have the ability to see ourselves separate from ourselves, or separate from our current situation. This is what makes us, our consciousness is what makes us human. And this is pivotal when it comes to uh, uh, finding ways to bring relief to those who feel oppressed, helping them understand their humanity, or helping them understand their humanism, not only helping the oppressed understand their humanity, humanism, but also helping the oppressor to find their own humanity, excuse me, and their own humanism and that of the people that they are oppressing as well. How does this work, or how do I understand this? Essentially, in order for someone to oppress someone else, something must happen in the mind of the oppressor. They must themselves first lose an understanding of their own humanity in order to perform an act that seeks to dehumanize someone else. This perspective is very critical because it shows that his perspective shows that when a person creates an act of dehumanizing someone else, they're doing so because they are themselves a victim of dehumanization. Another way of putting this is that hurt people hurt people. Liberation. Liberation is Fierides describes it as the power over self. Liberation is not just finding freedom from the power structure that is oppressing you, but instead is finding power over yourself and your ability to see yourself beyond being someone who is oppressed. And education, I love this concept that he presents here. He speaks about education as the power of love. I think this is critical when we're understanding, I think this is important when we're understanding critical theory, that if there needs to be, if there's a way to overcome systems of oppression, and if there's a way to overcome people who feel oppressed or marginalized, that this needs to be done within the context of love rather than the context of overthrowing or creating staging coups. And I think that this is something that Freire very eloquently shares in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Several application questions that I'd like to bring to your attention as we reflect on this is within the context of understanding critical theory and its relation to education. What is then true education? If education is not what we traditionally understand in our Western uh, framework, if we look at education through a critical lens, then how would we define true education if it is not social, or it's not intended to be social in nature or political in nature or economic in nature? Then what should it be? What is true education? And secondly, what should be the goals of true education? From critical theory perspective, the goal of true education would be to take away the power structures and empower the marginalized. How would you define, or how would you discuss what is the goal of true education after we define what it is, what it's defined philosophically? As a reflection prompt, if there is nothing that you wish to respond to in the previous parts of the lecture, I would like for us to discuss this reflection prompt, and that is, can a Christian scholar be supportive of critical theories? Um, you know, these critical theories have some values that we can consider biblically aligned, right? Like liberation, taking care of the oppressed, and deconstructing what society has deemed valuable. But there are also some very negative perspectives that can be negative within the lens of Christianity, and so I wonder what your thoughts are on that, and what your reflections are on that. Can a Christian scholar be supportive of critical theories? Anyways, thanks so much for your time. I hope this has been somewhat helpful to you, and I look forward to listening to your presentations as well. Take care.